Hello, and welcome back to the Dan Cave, and welcome back to the build of the Great Wall Hobbies 144th scale HP Victor K.2 I. So, we're now at part 4, and this video is going to focus mainly on paint, but I thought I'll just give a quick recap of what's been done in the previous parts. So part 1 was basically assembling the fuselage, getting the cockpit inside and gluing the fuselage together, getting that cleaned up. Part 2 was getting the wings assembled, getting the intakes done, the exhausts done, and then getting that glued to the fuselage. Part 3 I covered the final assembly of the overall aircraft, so horizontal tailplane, any of the external aerials, smaller intakes, bits and pieces, and the main fuel tank door on the underside. And that basically left the kit ready for this part, which is part 4, which will cover the main painting stage. That will consist of some coats of primer, first base coat, which will probably be the light aircraft grey on the underside, masking process to cover that up, and then the painting of the hemp colour on the top surface. And that should bring us to the end of part 4, and then future parts will move on with the deckling stage, weathering stage, and then the very final assembly. And hopefully that will bring us to the end, and I would expect it probably to go to about part 6. But we'll see how the time works out, because going through the video footage you may be able to compress some of it, but I would have thought 6 parts is where I'm aiming for with this build. So we might as well dive straight into the business end, and we'll go straight from here and straight over to the spray booth and have a look at the primer stage.
So it's pretty much straight on in with the priming. Actually starting off with priming the air brake doors and the undercarriage doors. Priming the same paint that's used for the overall fuselage, which is UMP grey primer. Sprayed about 30 psi. So prior to the priming stage, the model's been washed with some kitchen roll with some IPA on it, just to wipe it down and degrease any of the surfaces. And then we bring it over to the spray booth, and then we start generally with quite light passes, slowly going around, building up that coverage from the grey primer quite slowly. What you tend to find with this kind of UMP grey primer, which is essentially stynel res, Badger stynel res, it's pretty fast drying. It flashes over pretty quickly, so as you go around you will find you'll be able to repass over some bits. Obviously if you spray down a complete coat a little bit quicker, sometimes you need to leave it for a few minutes to flash up properly before you go back for a second coat. But often with an aircraft of this size, as I kind of go around spraying, I tend to find that some of the other bits have flashed off, so you can build up that coverage quite quickly. So it doesn't necessarily need kind of multiple coats. Of course, if the surface of the model needs it, you can kind of use the primer as a little bit of a micro filler. It does help sometimes fill some of the kind of micro scratches you get from sandpaper. Obviously in that case a number of coats can help, and then if you leave it dry for about 24 hours you can go back and sand it back to a very smooth finish. In this case there was hardly any filler used on this kit. Generally used quite a fine grit sanding stick to smooth off everything. So we can pretty much just get the coats we need laid down incredibly quickly. So as this kit has no kind of useful place to mount something, to hold it or kind of mount it on something that's undercarriage, so I tend to find it's easier to basically do them 2 stages. Do the upper side first, get everything nicely down, leave it for maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll be able to flip the model over to do the underside. in the same grey primer. So as mentioned, this is using UMP's grey primer, spraying it at 30 psi and using hardened steam back Infinity with the 0.5 or a 0.4 needle. The UMP primer sprays brilliantly through this airbrush. So now I'm just going to speed up the underside. Very similar to the top side, slowly build it up, get all the angles. So then it's on to the underside. So there's been the primer's left to dry for about 8 hours. And then we're on to applying the BS light aircraft grey from the Attack acrylics range. Now here I'm showing actually the second coat. The first coat was sadly lost on a memory card. So as with the primer, the process is very similar, but we're running at a much lower pressure. I think it's running at about 18 to 20 psi. And once again, the approach is to build up that paint layers in relatively slow, steady coats. Not necessarily looking for even coverage. A little bit of color variation is often quite useful. Can show a little bit of kind of variation in that gray tone. So there is the one kind of glaring error in painting this. I missed painting the underside of the very forward part of the nose. In my haste to start painting this, I kind of assumed that the hemp color actually wrapped around that forward part of the nose. It doesn't, but we'll fix that up later. So again, it's a case of getting in around all the angles, trying to add a little bit of variation in the grey. Now I didn't do any pre-shading on this. I mean, pre-shading is quite a common technique for adding some color variation. But because this is 144th scale, looking at reference photos, I didn't think that kind of color variation jumped out of the photos I looked at, so I didn't think it would be kind of representative of how I wanted the aircraft to look. So now that light aircraft grey is down and has been left to dry for, I think I left it for about 6 hours. It's actually on to what was probably the longest part of the paint stage, which is actually masking the underside. So I've shown it sped up because I think in total this took me about an hour and a half to do, because the hemp color actually wraps around the kind of leading edge and onto the underside, and the way it wraps around the fuel tanks and the refueling pods. I needed to basically mask off everything on the underside and all the light aircraft grey. So you can see here I've basically cut up some very thin strips. I'm going to use this to mark out the kind of main boundary of the scheme, and then I'll go back in with bigger pieces to infill the other areas. So in pretty much all cases, I'm detacking this tape on either my hand or my forearm, and this helps reduce the risk of pulling up any of the previous layers of paint, because that has happened to probably most of us at some point when kind of airbrushing and masking. So this is quite a long process and can be quite tedious, but it definitely rewards kind of patience and a little bit of precision as well. So it's around this point I noticed that I actually didn't mask, or I didn't paint the light aircraft grey on the forward part of the underside. I will come back later to correct that. As it started the masking, I thought I'll just keep on going and get the hem colour done. So I normally use Tamiya masking tape, but in this case I'm actually using some similar tapes that I found on Amazon. The green one I found okay. That yellow tape I've used is actually very, very similar to Tamiya masking tape. I think it's called Kip tape. some kind of washi tape. And it does seem to work very well. Don't get much bleed through. Very rarely pulls up paint if you detack it properly. So now I'm just kind of showing the part where I've gone around all the kind of the main boundary of the color scheme, and I'm basically blocking out all those sections of light aircraft grey on the underside. There are a number of ways to do this. I mean, you can use kind of paper, brown paper, mask off the edges and use larger sections, but given the size, it just seemed easier and quicker just to get a whole bunch of masking tape down. And as you can see on screen, it's actually quite a large roll of tape that I've got. So we're just using that kind of previously laid down edge. And this is the finished masking. So all the underside around the fuel tanks and the refueling pods. And that leads us straight on to getting the hemp paint, which is BS Camouflage Grey, again from the Hataka range of acrylic paints. So I start off by kind of focusing on the underside areas, where it wraps around, where it wraps onto the fuel tanks and the refueling pods. And again, starting to get a light coat on there, the underside of the intakes. This is where I spot that there's a little bit of masking tape just kind of folding up. I'll just burnish that back down with a cocktail stick. Then I can start filling in that hemp in again, light, relatively light passes, running at about 18 to 20 psi. And start to build up that quite distinctive RAF camouflage grey colour. The Hataka paints I actually found that the colour is very good. I did find them from the bottle to be probably a little bit too thick for airbrushing straight. So I have used probably about, 20-30% of UMP thinner added, just to thin them a little bit. They definitely seem to flow a lot better with a little bit of thinner added. So again, I'm still focusing on the kind of side and underside parts, and make sure all those kind of angles in around the kind of nose and engine intake areas are covered, and around fuel tanks. So by doing all this, it means I can basically put the model back down on the little turntable, and then I don't have to pick it up again, really. Just makes it a lot easier to work your way through the paint like that. So because of the kind of relatively large area and the way I've approached kind of painting it, I'll take this wing for example. By the time I finish this wing, move on to the opposite side, by the time I get to the opposite side finished, that wing is pretty much flashed over and you can start misting on a second coat. So the one thing you want to avoid with pretty much any airbrushing is flooding the surface. You don't want to completely filling those kind of nicely refined panel lines on this kit. Had I done some pre-shading, this technique would have been very good to kind of show up that color variation around the panel lines. But because the research material and the photos I looked at, the panel lines are not very obvious in them anyway. I don't think it would suit this particular aircraft. There will be some weathering added later on, but that will mainly be more of a kind of staining, filtering kind of approach on kind of probably mainly the underside, a little bit around control surfaces. But a panel wash is definitely not required for this kit, not looking at photos that I've seen anyway. So the paints that I've used for this kit, the two grey colours come from Hataka's range of acrylic paints. These both came from the modern Royal Air Force paint set, Volume 5. I have to say I've been quite impressed with them so far. I have used this brand of paint previously, but on this occasion I have to say I've been really, really impressed with it. A little bit thick, does need a little bit of thinning, but it has worked very, very well. I'm very pleased with it. So the airbrush I'm using is the Harder and Steenbeck Infinity. It's got the 0.5 needle in it, or 0.4, I think it's 0.5. And with acrylic paints, there is a can often get tip dry with this airbrush. It's not as easy to clean as perhaps some other airbrushes when using acrylic paints, but for me it's been absolutely no problem. It's a lovely airbrush to use. The weight and balance on the trigger are fantastic. That's certainly my kind of go-to airbrush for most things. So now that the kind of wings and tail area are done, I can start kind of doing some passes across the rear fuselage. I can start building up colored there as well. And you know, this paint reasonably warm in my kind of modeling room, so this paint flashes off very, very quickly. And pretty much by the time I've got one coat done, it's all flashed off perfectly well, and I can go and basically do almost like an immediate second coat on top. I mean, if you spray it down a little bit quicker, you may want to leave the paints for 10 or 20 minutes before you go back to the second coat. So the spray booth I'm using is I can't remember what brand it is, but it's one of those kind of foldable, portable ones, probably imported from China, I think. Relatively cheap, but works very, very well. Certainly for smaller kits, it's fine to use. So here I am going back in for the second coat. It was pretty much no break between the first and second coats. I think I just had to put some more paint in the cup. So. But as I was saying, that the spray booth, you can see the filter needs to be changed. The filters are readily available. You can buy them individually, or you can buy a large roll of filter material and make your own. But it does make a kind of huge difference to my modeling room. I don't have to worry about kind of overspraying the room. When kind of working with acrylics in smaller jobs, it's not always necessary to wear a face mask. I think when spraying kind of a bit larger and at higher pressures, I would recommend wearing a face mask. It does, you will be able to smell the kind of paint fumes. Not that acrylics smell that much, but you can certainly kind of smell the likes of Hataka and Tamiya paints. And I think this little turntable actually came with the spray booth, which was a nice addition. So now I've just spotted a tiny little bit of dust on the leading edge. Grab a pair of tweezers and pull that off. And we're just getting around some of the final little bits, just to get the last kind of few little places I think we need. As I said earlier on, the intakes, the intakes were originally painted white. Looking at pictures, it's not obvious. Probably is white further in, but certainly the hemp color wraps around inside the intakes. Quick look round. Quick final blast of some of the wrapped around areas. I think this is the only time I had to pick up model since the hemp was done, but that vertical tail plane was pretty much completely dry. But always be careful, there is always a risk if you pick up a model with fresh paint. So now this is probably the most pleasurable bit, removing the masking tape. Pleasurable, but also filled with trepidation because you're often so worried about pulling up some of that paint. So 2 hours of work to put the masking tape on, well, an hour and a half's work to put the masking tape on, undone by 10 minutes of removing the tape. So we're just using tweezers to carefully remove it all, and that's it. That's the main color done. So because the undercarriage bays were left and the air brake bays were also left, they all need to be painted silver. So I'm just going around with a little bit of masking tape just to cover up those areas. So for around the undercarriage bay, I just used basically a knife to run around the edge, just where the masking tape is. Around the air brakes, a couple of small strips just to outline the air brake area. Same technique as before, detacking the tape, basically covering up any area that's likely to see overspray. Some people, will use a piece of card to act as a kind of a shield while they're painting. For me, because there was all basically 5 little areas to do, it just seemed easier just to go back over with sheets of masking tape. I think I'm using Vallejo Model Air Silver just to basically infill those landing gear, main landing gear, nose landing gear, and air brake base. Again, spraying this at probably 20 psi, probably a little drop of thinner as well with the Model Air, and all through the H&S Infinity again. Again, it's got a small booth, so when you're trying to film what you're doing as well, I've noticed you do end up at some kind of awkward angles to try and keep stuff on screen. There we go. So the inside of the landing gear doors and the air brake doors are also sprayed silver at the same time. And once again, it's time to remove that masking tape. So I'm showing it in real time just to show that you need to be relatively careful. Gently peel it off. Make sure you don't pull up any of the lower coats of paint. But with the prep I've done with cleaning it with IPA, good coat of primer, given plenty of time, giving a reasonable amount of time to dry, and the light aircraft grey, that also allowed time to dry. There's limited risk of the paint peeling off. So this kind of last section of removing the masking tape from where the undercarriage bays and air brake bays were sprayed pretty much brings the video to conclusion for part 4. That's all the external paint work complete. The finish is nice and smooth, matte finish. And in part 5, we'll get on with the deckling process to go on, and then clear coat, and probably some weathering in part 5, and seeing how all the footage works out. We'll see how far we get in that. So my kind of earlier prediction of 5 or 6 parts seems to be working out fine. So as a reminder for part 4, we've started off with bare plastic. We've gone through coats of UMP primer, grey primer. We've used the Hataka acrylic paints to do the light aircraft grey on the bottom, masked up all the areas you want masked, and then laid down the BS camouflage grey or hemp on the top. Removed all the masking tape, then masked up the wheel bays and the air brakes, and then painted them in silver. So another important consideration with removing masking tape is when it's firmly stuck down is to use tweezers. If you have to use a knife to get under an edge, you have to be very, very careful that you don't damage the paint surface. And you can see here I'm kind of slowly peeling that masking tape away. But so far so good. There's been no issues. So for those of you who've lasted this long through the video, thank you very much. Please give a like, a subscribe, leave a comment if you want. I'll try and answer all comments. But thank you for watching, and yeah, I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen. So hopefully part 5 will be up in probably about another week. So far these videos seem to be working at one a week, which kind of a good kind of frequency to do these. But yeah, so we shouldn't have to wait too long for the next part. So here's an example of trying to get that tape up with using a knife, just to get a little bit of a corner lifted with the very edge of a knife. So really you're just trying to make sure that you grab the tape rather than grab any part of the paintwork. And the same again here. So I definitely recommend this kit. There's not a huge amount of detail. It is quite small scale, so you wouldn't expect it, but it is very, very nicely molded. Goes together well. The scale is a good size for big bombers. That works for me. And that's the paint stage completed.